I think today, as you rightfully say, there's a lot of emphasis on data privacy, cybersecurity, transparency, accuracy of algorithms. Let's work on all of these and come up with ways to prepare ourselves. But in my opinion, there is not enough preparation when it comes to oversight and enforcement.
Hi everyone, it's Lauren Hawker-Zaffer. Welcome back to Redefining AI, the Tech Podcast. I'm an educator and I'm taking you on an educational exploration. As each day passes, it is becoming ever clearer that the impact of AI over the next decade will be enormous. And many are starting to accredit more truth to the fact that the only way to deal with real later challenges, from economic ones to societal ones to ecological ones, is through regulation. With the frequent announcements around Brussels' desire to pass world-leading regulation on developing AI, it seems somewhat fitting to place spotlight on AI policy in today's episode. AI policy, how to move the needle forward. Now, to explore this topic, I've been joined by the voice that is Ayisha Piotti. Ayisha is the managing partner at the Swiss-based firm Reg Horizon and the director of AI policy at the Centre for Law and Economics of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the ETH Zurich. Ayisha and her colleagues at the Centre for Law and Economics at the ETH Zurich are the visionaries behind the largest global AI policy summit in Switzerland. The summit was attended in 2022 by 82 countries spanning 6 continents and is a multi-stakeholder event where representatives from academia, businesses, NGOs, citizens, and policymakers from all over the world come together to discuss the implications of AI on society and policy and build AI policy together for a better world. So welcome, Ayisha. It's fantastic to have you here.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, Lauren.
How's your year going? What are you connecting with at present?
Well, it's, lots going on at the moment, as you probably are following. I think it's a great year, I would say, for AI policy specifically. I'm actually quite happy because we seem to have this topic now coming into the mainstream. Right. And essentially, when I started working on AI policy, 3-4 years ago, it was very much sort of a niche topic. But of course, now with ChatGPT and DALL-E and what's been going on, I think there is a lot of focus, which I think is a very good thing. So it keeps me busy.
Yes, I'm sure that you are busy. I think that when a lot of topics, especially niche topics that have not had as much mass attention, come into the public eye, in mainstream media, then it certainly does promote exploration in different avenues, doesn't it? So let's start at the beginning then, Ayisha, and take things maybe from a macro level for our audience. What are the key challenges today for AI governance and global harmonization of AI policy?
Well, thank you, Ashley Lauren. I think it's a great question. And I'd like to sort of maybe start by saying something, because whenever we talk about regulation and binding regulation specifically, I think it's important to understand that really it's just one way to help balance the risks with the opportunities of new technologies in this case, right? And indeed, I personally am a big believer in the power of the new technologies, And so I do think as a society, our common goal really is to build trust, right? Build trust in the technology and helps its adoption. And I believe that policy helps you to do that. So just to start with. And therefore, when you think about it, I do believe that having an approach, a harmonized approach is important. But then coming back to your question, Lauren, there are essentially, in my mind, 3 categories of challenges. The first one, I would say, is more philosophical. The second one relates to the approach. And the third is more so with preparation. So maybe if I can just start, maybe I can just explain a little bit what I mean by them.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would be good if you sort of approach those 3 different challenges that you've highlighted and explain a little bit about it.
So when I talk about philosophical, what do I mean? I think that there is essentially, 2 schools of thought. There is a bit of a tension, which is about shall we or shall we not even regulate? And when on the one hand, you've got people who say, well, we shouldn't be regulating new technologies because it essentially is hindering innovation. It's putting burden on us, right? And essentially with the pace of technological change we have, and we've seen that in the last few months with AI, there is really always going to be this huge gap in understanding on the part of the regulators, and they will always be lagging behind when it comes to, in fact, action, right? So essentially that sort of mental mindset is sort of saying, well, don't go and don't start regulating this thing now. On the other hand, of course, you've got those that think, well, society does need to be protected, from, of course, malicious harm, but I would say also unintended consequences of new technologies, which are now sometimes coming to forth, sometimes later than when they were being developed, right? And therefore, it should be regulated. There should be some sort of guardrails around these new technologies. And from a very business perspective, I think it's also important to look at it because businesses need to have certainty, right? And if you have basically not very many clear rules, it exposes businesses also to financial and reputational risks. And that's something that is, again, those that would say, I want to go and have a regulation. So I think when it coming back, so that's the first one. That's the philosophical challenge, which essentially exists with regards to regulate or not regulate.
Mm-hmm. If we just pause there and think about obviously those two thoughts or thought camps in the sense of to regulate or not to regulate, you mentioned that those that maybe don't want to regulate, they're more about pushing maybe a narrative of hindering innovation and that it's not ideal if there is too much regulation because it might hinder innovation. Are the repercussions of that school of thought something that affects rather future generations that are not necessarily considered enough? I mean, what would you emphasize there when people are talking about the hindrance of innovation from a non-regulation perspective?
I mean, if I'll just talk about my personal view there, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I don't necessarily think that having regulation would most certainly hinder innovation in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about it, when you look at it, I mean, we talked a little bit about the EU, you said in your intro as well. One of the reasons why the EU is actually more moving towards regulation essentially is to say, well, in fact, it will enable innovation. It will enable us to have certainty. It will enable us. And when you talk about future generations, is moving towards a kind of artificial intelligence or a kind of adoption of technologies that is good for our future generations, right, including our children. So I do not necessarily think that it is going to be something which will hinder. And again, I would just like to make a differentiation between short-term and long-term, right? And sometimes when you want to do something for the long-term good, there are obviously some implications in the short term, and that could be somehow perceived as very negative. But my personal opinion would be, I do not believe that that's necessarily the wrong way to go. The only thing is how. And of course, the proof is in the pudding, always there in the details.
So let's maybe move back to then the second and third expansion points.
Sure. So again, I talked about the three challenges. So the second one for me is with regards to, let's assume we say, well, we need, which is essentially where we're going. We're saying we need to have some kind of rules. We need to have some kind of guardrails. And when you start approaching this, you realize that to have harmonization at a global level is obviously going to be very difficult. And the reason for that is that there are very different geopolitical approaches today when it comes to how we are looking at regulation. So example being, let's say, if you take something like the United States, right? And this is, it's obviously an innovation-driven ecosystem, home to big tech. And I would say when it comes to actually regulating new technology, specifically AI, it's a very sort of soft touch kind of approach, right? I mean, we've seen some movement. So recently we did have the AI Bill of Rights. We had some, NIST with new standards, RAF framework, but essentially not looking at a federal level to move towards regulation. And that's generally in line with the mindset of how United States essentially operates, right? On the other hand, you have EU, we talked about it, coming with very binding, very strict rules, and the process is quite advanced. And then you have some others like, UK or even Switzerland to a certain extent, right? Which is like, we don't want to necessarily create new regulations. But what we want to do is to work more on principles and governments giving guidance, and at the same time then looking at better enforcement, right? And following and follow up. So that's a bit of the mindset there. And then you, of course, have China, very big player as well in this domain, and quite surprisingly, has been very active recently in terms of privacy, in terms of algorithmic regulations as well. But I would say, of course, surveillance and use of technology from that is different. One last point on this one that I would like to make is when we're looking at different approaches, I've mentioned a few, and that's where generally we are looking at. We have to understand that there's a very big part of the world today which is not even part of these discussions.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So we had this incredible study that was done, at ETH, which essentially looking mostly at what kind of, what is coming out in terms of policy. But what we realize is that when you look at Latin America, most part of Central Asia, a lot of African countries, they're not even part of the debate, right? But when you talk about global regulation around the topic and harmonization, well, we've got to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, extremely interesting points, those two challenges. If we look at maybe the first, the geopolitical challenge, and then the second, move on to the engagement and the whole discussion. So you have mentioned in the second challenge, like the regulation of artificial intelligence, it is a complex and multifaceted issue, and different geopolitical approaches to AI regulation. These can really make binding regulatory harmonization quite difficult, as we've been talking about. You mentioned as well, like example, the EU, it places a high value on protecting privacy and personal data, while maybe counter opposition, China, prioritizes more economic growth and technological advancement. We listed the three challenges. How key is this one though? And is it possible to overcome this one with the other two?
Yeah, I'll tell you about, just coming to just elaborate a bit on the third one, right? So we talked a little bit about, of course, the first one, which being philosophical, the second being the challenge with regards to different geopolitical approaches. I think another one which is linked to a little bit what you're saying as well is, for me, a preparatory challenge as well, right? And let me just, if you allow me to just explain what I mean by that,
yeah,
right? And that is going to be very key when we are going forward. I think today, as you rightfully say, there's a lot of emphasis on data privacy, cybersecurity, transparency, accuracy of algorithms. Let's work on all of these and come up with ways to prepare ourselves. But in my opinion, there is not enough preparation when it comes to oversight and enforcement.
Excellent input. But what do you mean exactly by oversight and enforcement?
I'm going to just explain that to you.
Perfect.
Let's take an example. Right? So let's take an example. We often hear about artificial intelligence systems should not or will not replace the humans, right? And we will always need to have these humans in the loop who are going to help with the AI-driven decisions, right? Now, if we just step back for a second and think, now, fact of the matter is that being this human in the loop is a massive responsibility for those who are going to be in these decision-making seats. And in addition, it will require these humans to have a very high level of context-specific knowledge, expertise, but as well as the confidence to make decisions when it comes to trade-offs, which essentially are what they're going to be looking at. So they will have that on the one hand. At the same time, we need to make sure that we prepare these individuals, right? Because they need to be prepared to make these decisions, and they should have the capacity. And the capacity not only to having the knowledge of specific field in which they're making decisions, but they need to be very much aligned with what the society is thinking. What are the broader sort of, requirements, right? Because you are looking at these trade-offs. So that's one thing. And then if you dig even one step deeper in that, what you realize is that humans in the loop concept, for example, you have a lot of studies that have been conducted that show that there is something called machine bias, right? Mm-hmm. So people tend to essentially very much trust machines, and that can lead to sometimes suboptimal decisions also. And in that case, for example, if you see, on the one hand, you can have wrong decisions being made, malicious intent, or it could be because of negligence. But it could be also because simply due to lack of proper training and capacity and knowledge building, which is really required for us to even enforce or work with, right, some of these presumptions that we have today in terms of how we will be moving forward. And this for me is I mean, of course, I have some ideas on how to tackle that, but to me, it's really an important challenge as well that we need to focus more on.
That would have been my next question, actually, Ayisha. It would be like, how do we tackle what you've highlighted here?
We tackle it, Lauren, essentially two ways. First of all, of course, it's awareness. We have to build awareness. We need to have a high awareness of this particular, and this is what we're doing, you and I today as well, right? And this is a little bit what my platform we've talked about is very much focused on as well. But then the second part for me would be to start building a capacity, and we have to start thinking about it now. Now, there's many ways to do that, but even if I take education, right? If you take look, and coming also from in representing also an educational institute, and education can be also for our children, right? When we start, and then it could also be later on for those that are already having to adapt to this change quite quickly. I believe that it's not just enough to have courses that we say, okay, our computer scientists are going to just learn, ethics. That's not enough. I think it's a bit of a mindset which needs to change with regards to multidisciplinary learning models, right? Which are emphasizing skills such as lateral thinking, connecting the dots, because ChatGPT has shown us that, code can be written very quickly also by machine. So what we need to be doing is having those abilities. And I think our children, our institutions should be looking at that. One more point with regards to education. I think today when we look at research also, we might need to think a little bit differently in terms of reward structures. So we are rewarded today on very specific research in specific areas. I mean, maybe we should be looking at multidisciplinary reward structure for research, which is looking at the world much more broader. And I think that needs to be done as well, right? And then, of course, I don't know, we have normally licenses to drive cars, right? I mean, looking in the future, do you think we should maybe licenses for being human in the loop in a certain field? I'm not quite sure. But, this is the kind of way I think we should be approaching the topic.
Certainly, there's a lot to consider there. And if we look at maybe the broader world and what's happening in alignment with ushering more education or policy enforcement, we can maybe move on to look at the EU regulatory developments in particular. Can you maybe fill us in on what developments are happening at the moment and at what stage they're at? Maybe the Brussels effect of the EU regulations in general, EU AI Act, Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, Council of Europe.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm not going to spend too much time on the details, right? But what is very important is that EU, in my opinion, obviously has a great influence when it comes to global policy developments, right, in regulation. And this is not just in technology. This has been the case in all various different other areas as well. And how does that happen? And that's quite important to understand. We have this term which is called the Brussels effect, right? And the best example of Brussels effect for your listeners, I think, could be the GDPR, right? The General Data Protection Regulation that came in.
Yeah.
And a regulation like that, which was really quite groundbreaking, impacted not just the EU citizens, right, but citizens across the globe. And how did it do that? Because one, it had an extraterritorial impact, right? Which means that even if you're a business sitting in the US or in Africa, if you're going to do business with EU, you have to absolutely apply this rule. Now, think about it. If I am a multinational or something sitting, I would sort of say, well, why not just use this as a standard? It's easier for me from a perspective of costs and efficiency to have it across the board as well. So you tend to even sort of proactively start using that regulation or those standards pretty much across the board. Not everybody, but I'm just saying that could be one way. Another way we can explain what we call the Brussels effect is also that other governments, when you have something coming out of the EU in terms of regulation, especially, look at it more like a gold standard, right? So it's sort of like, well, this is EU is known to do regulations very well. Mm-hmm. Let's just take that. I am in another country, and of course, there's a debate about whether that's good or bad, right? I mean, maybe copy paste is not a great idea, and it has to be context specific for the country. But we see that happening, and even we saw some of that when the EU came with the GDPR. We had the same thing happening in certain states like California with its Privacy Act. So I think that is one thing. And just bringing back to AI, your question, yes, the EU currently is looking at the EU AI Act, right, which is going to be one of really groundbreaking and most comprehensive set of rules, binding rules around AI. I shall not probably go into the details of it. What I can say to you is in terms of process, it's almost a lot of work has been done this year. We're looking towards the end of the year to find kind of a finalization of this act. Recently, in terms of some main discussions were around the definition of AI. And also now, of course, because it's a risk-based sort of a regulatory structure, the new discussions were, well, we had these 8 categories, which were high-risk categories. Should we also include now, generative AI systems and ChatGPTs and this kind of thing? And there's a lot of discussion around that. So I think it's going to be very hot. It's going to be very hot in the coming days to follow that. Yeah, you had a question, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just pondering if you also think that will have a similar Brussels effect. If you think that the introduction of the EU AI Act will also leak out and have a positive effect on other countries, or if it'll maybe have a counter-targeted effect where there's maybe a reduction or a restriction of a willingness to want to apply, and maybe an exodus to somewhere where there's not an introduction of an AI Act. What's your own opinion on that?
I love this question because I think it is a key question. If I think about, quite frankly, again, my opinion, I would assume that the intent of the EU is for it to, of course, have the Brussels effect, right? That is the intention, and that's what they would like to do. Whether it's going to be, how it is going to be, of course, implemented will depend on the different countries and everything. But one of the things I think is important to see as well, whilst EU, of course, there's a lot which is going on between the EU and the US, because US is a key partner. How US is going to end up going is going to be quite relevant, right? So I mean, again, if I have to project, right, is this going to mean that we are going to really have a move towards basically globalization and everybody going around? I think the jury is still out on that one, right? Because as I said, there are, and if I'm not wrong, there are other countries around the world that are actually having different approaches. And we've talked about, and some of them, I mean, US, but you had, I think, if I'm not wrong, in your program, Z King from Singapore some time ago, right? Yeah. So they're, and and the mindset is slightly different, right? It's sort of saying, well, yes, we need to have guardrails. Yes, we need to have some rules and but the how is very important. And if you think about it, you've got other countries. We talked about UK, Switzerland, some in the East are thinking slightly differently. So are we going to have like 2 different things that people can choose from, or is it going to be the harmonized? It's a good question. I don't know the answer specifically.
Yeah, it's this conscious sort of consideration as well around the word harmonization, because as we've discussed and you've outlined very proficiently, is, you've got so many like inclusive components that you have to consider. You've got the different values and priorities of each individual country. You've got the different legal systems. You've got the different regulatory frameworks. You've got, as you've mentioned at the start, the geopolitical tensions. So, really to strive for an overarching binding regulatory harmonization, it is a conversation that definitely needs to keep happening to really encourage positive movement for harmonization. There's so many things that I want to talk about, but we're also conscious that we are limited. So let's maybe move on, Ayisha, to looking at maybe trying to balance the current regulatory practices with future needs. Because this can also be a challenging task. Like, how can we balance current regulatory practices with what will be needed for the future? How do we identify future needs? Maybe identify the potential future needs of the industry. What can we do to identify changing market conditions and evolving sort of consumer expectations? After all, this will help to anticipate maybe the regulatory requirements that will be necessary in the future.
Perfect. Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid question, right? And I think it's very much top of mind on I would say pretty much most of the regulatory circles, right? And I think the sheer pace of technological development has put that up and center now. Now, if I was to think a little bit about balance and balancing, and taking it first from a regulator's perspective, I would say there's two elements to it. There is the what and the how. So I do think in terms of mindsets, governments will need to be moving away from the traditional mindset of let's regulate and forget mindset, move it more towards let's adapt and learn, right, in terms of regulatory approaches that they are going to be looking at, right? And this is essentially because of, what we talked about right in the beginning, because of the pace of change. And so they need to be putting in this concept or mindset of flexibility, shall I say, as one thing going forward. This will need to be done. I also believe, and we touched upon it a little bit, that governments will have to become a lot more smarter with regards to enforcement. Right. A lot of innovation also needed in terms of how we are going to enforce what we think we are going to be, and it's going to be all flexible and it's going to be moving. So a lot of thinking to be done on that perspective. Now we talk about the how, and I think it goes to what you just said also, like how do we look at, what the needs of the industry are and how do we essentially move towards something which is making sense. And in this one, for me, what is very important is, again, a bit of a shift, right? So classically, the way regulations are made is in many parts of the world, not always the case. I mean, in Switzerland, perhaps that's not the case because of our direct democracy, is that you sort of, governments come up with a legal text and then what they have what they would call public consultations, right? And then the public comes in and it gives their inputs and then they sort of say, this is okay, this is not okay, let's amend or not amend. I think we've got to move away from that and we've got to go a bit more into what I say is a real meaningful stakeholder engagement, which needs to start way early in the process. So you've got to start. So we have to the extent of even identification of what the problems are, identification of the needs of the industry are. If we're thinking it from that perspective, right? If we say as a government, look, I mean, it's not going to be, I'm going to come up with my bureaucrats with something and people will just consult. It's too late, right? And you probably have so many things that you've forgotten about. So here it's about looking at it from a perspective of saying, let us have meaningful stakeholder engagement. And again, we talked about Singapore when it comes to mind, but they have this great system that they've put in place where you even help with, the actual industry is helping to identify the issues. So I think it will also have another very interesting and important impact, which I think which is something which I believe a lot of society is looking at, is that you will be able to analyze better the distributional impact of these regulations on stakeholders that could be, disproportionately impacted, right? Because you can include all of that. So I would say that would be one main thing in terms of the how. Of course, better communication. I do believe that even the regulators can say, and I think they can be honest about the limits of the regulation. They can be honest about the risks, and therefore this will only help to build the trust, right? And of course, international cooperation is always good. I mean, the United Nations plays a part there. There is the UN Global Compact now, which is looking at sort of digital and how we can approach it. UNESCO came with some guidelines, overall arching guidelines. And I think there is room for that. I just wanted to mention here that, I recently was also looking at the OECD regulatory policy outlook. They do incredibly good work on that. They have this thing called Regulatory Policy 2.0, which is essentially developing these ideas, which I think would be useful for your listeners if they want to go refer to some of this future. How do we look at the change? So that would be more from a regulatory perspective.
Very much so, yeah. We can certainly encourage them to go and have a look at that. So from what I'm understanding, we're looking at more of a conscious, a collaborative, and inclusive, and certainly a more communicative nature of engagement to ensure that we can usher this into a better status and being able to identify potential future needs for the industry. Maybe then one last question. So what will be needed from a larger social perspective for this?
I think a very, very good question, because you're talking to somebody who truly believes in sort of multi-stakeholder global dialogue, discussions, raising awareness, raising capacity, and I am a big believer that all of us need to be involved. This is an important topic. I personally believe this is something which is important for our next generations. And we need to be not only following what is going on, but we need to be active in what is going on, right? So that's the first thing. And in order to do that, we most certainly need, my one message there, and I'll come back to some other ones, but here I'm talking more to citizens, even just as a citizen or a business leader. My message is really to proactively, in a way, follow what is going on, understand and assess the impact on, your business, your personal life, your children, everything else, and then get involved in the process, because a lot of the policy is being made now, right? And this will have an impact on how we are shaping the future. So, and another point is, you don't necessarily need to be an engineer. You don't need to be a data scientist to be part of this debate. And I think a lot of people probably don't think about it this way. But more and more so, we need people from different backgrounds and different walks of life to be. So that's the first thing. I do have two suggestions for governments. Yeah, I do think that it is all very nice to say, well, let's just have more of these discussions. Let's have new processes. But all of this requires allocation of budgets. Right? It requires allocation of budgets for an allocation of focus from our politicians, right? From our government representatives. If we even look at dialogue, I mean, how do you do it? Through centers of expertise. You need to support your innovation hubs. We need to have facilitating smaller players. All of that needs, and building your trust within your citizens. You need to have resources, time, effort, allocation, and maybe processes to do that, right? So that's one thing. And for academia, I think I've already sort of said what potentially they can do. So it's really, for me, something that we need to be activated on and working on together. And that's what a little bit we are doing at Rec Horizon, but also with, you mentioned right in the beginning, our global conference.
Yes, and your global conference is also, you're hosting another one as well, if I understand correctly.
Exactly. So I'm really, really happy, because we will have the next session, which will be the 4th year running, and it's a growing platform. So we're very proud of that. And it's one point I would like to say is it's also very inclusive. And one of the things we did last year, and I made the point about inclusion. So we had a lot of input also from India. We had input from Africa. We actually had a partnership on certain topics with UNESCO. So the idea is to make it global, to make it inclusive. We talked about, and 82 countries. We would aim for even more this year, and it will be taking place in November 3rd and 4th at the ETH Zurich main campus building. We are currently, in fact, looking for even inputs when it comes to topics that are relevant and interesting for people. We, of course, have a few that we are thinking about, but for me, this would be a great opportunity for business leaders, or even, just citizens, or essentially experts, thought leaders, everybody to get together along with policymakers, because that's what we do as well, because I think that is very important to sort of build this future that we need to build together.
Wonderful engagement. I mean, it certainly underlines your own commitment and attitude towards creating this environment for a multi-stakeholder input where people can follow, they can understand, they can assess situations. I think myself, as both a citizen and a mother, what is of concern, and I think that should be analysed quite carefully as well, and considered, is how children are growing up in the age of AI. I think that there is a potential danger that young children, young adults do fall into certain traps of what you mentioned at the start, Ayisha, around the whole machine bias. I mean, placing so much trust on machine and not considering components that should be regulated and heavily included in safe AI usage and policy for current and future generations.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, for me as well, I have to say that my whole passion for this topic and my raison d'etre of even Reg Horizon comes from that kind of thinking where, also being a mother, I'm very, very much looking to say, how can I contribute to ensure that, this new technologies are really serving our next generations in the right way, right? And keep away from the harms and that they can bring as well. And protection of children is certainly one of the key ones. So yeah, can't agree more.
So thank you. It's been wonderfully insightful having you on the show, and I hope you've enjoyed being with us today and being part of Redefining AI.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation once again. Thanks to you, Lauren. Thanks to Squirrel. And until next time.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank everyone else for listening today to this episode of Redefining AI. If you'd like to find out more about Search AI machine learning, then head over to learn.squirrel.com. Thank you.